Good morning, everyone. Let's see, what should I preach on today? Anybody got any suggestions? This morning, I want to continue in our series on Christian rhythms. And these Christian rhythms can help us develop self-control in our lives and help us to follow and live the way that Jesus did, as Jesus practiced these rhythms. And so we can take a page out of his book and say, okay, how do I walk with God from day to day? These rhythms can help. They can give us a life of peace with God the Father at any moment of any day, no matter what it is that we're facing. These rhythms challenge us to rethink and to have second thoughts about the way that we live, the assumptions that we have while we're living for Jesus. Because sometimes we make assumptions and we can easily be a little bit blinded to maybe there's another way to approach life. So to explore these possible blind spots or areas that we aren't quite ready to deal with, we've been looking at these Christian rhythms. And so last week I talked a bit about the rhythm of frugality and how it isn't about the amount of wealth that I was concerned about last week, but rather our view of money and how we spend it. How do we use money? Well, that's really important to know. Oh, I saw you there. I wasn't sure if I should turn around and see if there's flashing. Oh, yeah, okay. This is good. Something's highlighted here. You could take what you want out of it. Anyways, frugality helps us also to see that there are the needs of others, and that the needs of others can easily be either avoided or ignored or set aside because the way that we spend money becomes, well, too extravagant. And in North America, we know that extravagance is all over the place. And so we took a look at that. We studied it a bit and we saw, yeah, you know what? Maybe there's some areas about how I spend money or how many things I accumulate that needs to be brought under check. And so money tends to be a sensitive subject, and most people don't appreciate it, how much money, if you ask them how much money they make, they especially will not appreciate it if you ask them how they spend their money. And so we do need to take a look at our own personal rhythms and talk about it as families and just say, how can we spend our money more wisely so that we don't neglect being able to give to the poor or helping people in need or neglecting tithes and offerings. And that way we see everything that we have as a gift from God, and we use it the way God wants us to. But we've also been looking at other rhythms because we've noticed that there's struggles in our lives. Now, for instance, the first rhythm we looked at was the rhythm of solitude. How many of you find a hard time having time alone? Anybody here, like you're just constantly busy? Maybe some of you are like, I get lots of time alone. You know, this is wonderful. Or some of you are saying, I need more people in my life. But solitude can say, if you're spending so much time alone, I can spend time alone with the Lord when I'm having a hard time doing that. Or the rhythm of silence. Maybe your lives are so filled with noise. For instance, one day this last week, I sat down in my kitchen and I thought, I'm just going to listen to see how many noises there are around me. So I've got the fridge. Now the fridge just makes its perpetual hum, and then when it's making ice, it makes another noise. And then you have noises like the fans that are blowing in the house. Or if the furnace fan kicks in because it's going to bring cold air up from the basement. Or the TV is on, or somebody's playing music in their room, or the neighbors are cutting the grass. And the list goes on and on and on. All of a sudden we find out, you know what, we don't have silence very often. So the discipline of silence can help us find time away from everyone, away from everything, to read God's word and say, what is God saying to me? So we can learn to listen. We've looked at fasting. Fasting is useful for a number of reasons. Not only does it help to keep in check our bodily cravings and not be controlled by the cravings for food in our lives, but it teaches us to have self-control, not just with food, but with anything else that your body is craving. And that leads me into my message today. Today we tackle another sensitive topic. So if I talked about money last week, I'm talking about sex today. And so more specifically, the spiritual rhythm of chastity. Now, before you make an assumption that I don't want you to make. I'm not talking about making a vow of chastity for the rest of your life. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking, though, about learning to control the impulses within our bodies. And I'll get more into that here in just a moment. Kenneth Boa, in his book titled Conformed to His Image, wrote, "The discipline of chastity is relevant to all believers, whether they are single or married. The discipline recognizes that the sexual appetite is a legitimate part of our natures, but it encourages us to resist the painful consequences of improper feelings, fantasies, obsessions, and relations that are so frequently reinforced in our culture. Chastity elevates loving concern for the good of others above personal gratification." Chastity is another one of those disciplines that falls under the category of abstinence. We refrain from doing things, having sexual thoughts and actions for the sake of learning to control our sexual appetite that often dominates the hearts and minds of humanity. As Dallas Willard comments in his book, we purposefully turn away from dwelling upon or engaging in the sexual dimension of our relationships to others, even our husbands or wives. We intentionally, purposefully do this in this discipline. And we're going to discover why. So as I study this discipline, there were two really important reasons why a Christian should consider practicing this discipline. First, it trains you to control your thoughts and emotions. That's important. Second, it trains you to have friendships with the opposite sex that doesn't lead to sexual thoughts or feelings. I think we all can agree that our culture is hypersexualized, and it isn't going away. In fact, it continues to get worse. Humanity continues to find new ways to distract themselves from the priorities in life because sexuality dominates the identity and psyche of the individual. Our sexuality does reach the very essence of our being. But once sexuality becomes the dominant or primary focus of identity, it is easy to forsake the other aspects of our identity or the identity of others, thus seeing people simply as sexual objects, including ourselves. One of the most common ways we have seen the degradation of people as sexual objects is through prostitution. That's been a historical problem. In Canada, there is a bill titled Bill C-36, and it sought to criminalize the people who purchase sex, not the ones who sell themselves for sex. One might wonder why the hairs have been split here, but Bill C-36 sought to see that the sexual workers were victimized and should not be criminalized because they are willing or coerced into selling their bodies sexually for money or goods. The effort was trying to reduce the demand for prostitution, not the desire to prostitute ourselves. Another way we see the degradation of people as sexual objects is through pornography. People are no longer people with pornography. They are supposed to be seen as created in the image of God, to be honored and cherished as God's creation, as sons and daughters of mums and dads, and sisters to fellow siblings. The Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, a lobbying group that seeks to tackle subjects such as the care for vulnerable, religious freedom, sanctity of life, family and community, and the church's mission, pornography is one such subject that they lobby to the federal government to create laws to protect people subjugated by the porn industry. The EFC writes, "Pornography promotes a distorted sexuality devoid of love, respect, genuine intimacy, or self-giving. It teaches that people are products to be used and consumed and fosters sexual entitlement and selfishness. Both adults and children are used and abused in the creation, distribution, and use of pornography. Our culture has a sex problem, and it is difficult to fight against it when people feel they have a right to treat their bodies however they want, or to treat other people however they want. For us Christians, we need to start with the holiness of God and His creation of humanity as people to be honored and cherished, not used and abused. We are to live within the confines of what God intended for us. Otherwise, we continue the perpetual cycle of eating from a tree that was not designed for us to eat from. However, while we are going to talk about the practice of chastity, and to practice it properly, we must not go to the other extreme and demonize sex. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 teaches us that God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth. For humanity to fulfill that command, to have the earth filled with people, requires a lot of sex. Sex was created as a good thing, and its practice was restricted within the relationship of marriage between one man and one woman. There is no such thing as casual sex. It is intensely personal and is deeply embedded in the core of our being. However, when a culture becomes consumed by sex, it can quickly become distracted from building a better nation and protecting its people from exploitation. And when Christians are distracted by sex, they are unable to see people for who they are, including our spouses, and are distracted from walking with God. Hence the rhythm of chastity. When practiced properly, it will have a number of benefits so you can enjoy your freedom to live for God. So let us take a look at 3 texts of Scripture today. The first is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. And it says this: "Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." My first point in my message is that chastity, prayer, and self-control, these things go hand in hand. Paul knew that sex had its points of contention and it has power. Here he mentions that abstention for the sake of prayer was a good thing, but only for a short time. And a little later in chapter 7, he mentions that those who remain unmarried, if they cannot control themselves, that it's better to marry than burn with passion. So what's going on here? People are abstaining from sex, but it's causing them problems. So why is chastity even recommended if burning with passion will cause problems? I think the fact that we as humans burn with passion is the source of where things go wrong. Sexuality is hardwired in us, and most people will not be able to handle singleness. The passions are strong and will push people towards sin. But God does call some to remain celibate. But abstinence for the wrong reasons will leave people to burn. Dallas Willard wrote about this about this very verse, and he says, "The burning here in question is something very serious in its implications. Not just a trivial inward matter. It spills out into human life in many ways. Severe distortion of thought and emotion, inability to engage in normal and appropriate sexual relations, disgust and hatred between frustrated men and women, even abuse of children, sexual perversion, and sex murders. Chastity rightly practiced as part of an overall rich walk with God can draw the poison from sexual abstinence and prevent the sickness of heart and mind that now runs amok in the sexual dimension of life in today's world." So as in the other disciplines, chastity can be done through legalism rather than through the Spirit. If done poorly, it will cause more problems. But I think you can begin to see the heart of the issue behind sex. The desires are so powerful that they can consume you whether you were married or not. And learning to not be perpetually controlled by those desires is at the heart of this discipline. This discipline will take time and practice. It will require you to know ahead of time that if you go into a mall or drive by a billboard that is sexually provocative, you will need to commit your mind to not look at them and gratify your desires. This discipline does not teach that sex is bad. It teaches the suffering that comes from sexuality does come in large part from improper indulgence in sexual thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and relations. But much also comes from improper abstinence. The right kind of abstinence at the right time for the right reasons. Learning to have self-control with consent from your spouse for the sake of growing closer to God and relying upon Him, and to respect your spouse as someone more than an object, is part of why we do this discipline. Voluntary abstention helps us appreciate and love our mates as whole persons, of which their sexuality is but one part. And it confirms us in the practice of being very close to people without sexual entanglements. So let us look at the second text in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3 to 4. And the Apostle Paul wrote this, and he said, "It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, and that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable." Point number 2, chastity and holiness. I think this text is pretty self-explanatory. We have to learn how to abstain from sex and from indulging in sexual desires and thoughts rather than be governed by them. It is this principle that completely eludes our culture. For our nation, sexual desire is not something to control, but to be controlled by, or to give into at the very least. The sexual revolution and the resulting confusion is one of the pulses of our nation. If it's not sex, then maybe it's ideology and the lack of self-control to respect others who think differently. You'll see that all over social media. But according to Paul, we are to learn self-control for the sake of holiness, not in passionate lust like the heathen who do not know God, as he says later on in verse 5 of this text. But sometimes sexual promiscuity is just a cover for something deeper. Another area that requires self-control. So allow me to tell a story. Tim Keller mentioned this story when he was alive. He just passed away this year. He was a pastor in New York, and he told this story. He said, "Many years ago when I was in college, I was part of a Christian fellowship, and there was a young man who joined up, and it shocked us all. This young man was famous on campus for being incredibly sexually active, and he had the looks to go with it. He was handsome and charismatic. And then to our surprise, he came into the fellowship where he declared that he's a Christian now, and he forswears his sexual past, and he is going to live a chaste, pure life. He threw himself into the Christian activities. Everyone said, 'Wow, this is a real change.' However, it wasn't long before we came to realize that this young man in every group, any committee, any Bible study where he was the leader or not, he had to be the leader. He always sought control. There was power struggle after power struggle, and after a while it became clear that when he was sexually active, it really wasn't about sex, it was about power. He would go after some girl until she fell for him, and then he lost all interest. It wasn't about sex at all. It was about power. And when he came into the church, he suddenly adopted all the Christian beliefs, the statements of faith, the Christian practices. He stopped living in sexual promiscuity, but deep down inside, he still wanted power. Power in relationships. And Keller points out that we all have the need for deeper conversion in our heart. He says, deep down inside, every one of our hearts is saying, if I have money, if I have approval, if I have power, if I have comfort, if I have control, if I have romance, every one of our hearts needs that deeper conversion from the idols to the living God. The practice of chastity can reveal other hidden motivations of the heart that call us to motivations of the heart, and that we should be called to holiness. In this man's life, he didn't know he had a control problem. Sin hides behind sin. There are layers. And it goes far deeper than we know. So allow me to read to you another passage of Scripture from Proverbs chapter 13, verse 12. And it says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Point number 3, chastity and heart sickness. A proverb conveys a general truth that can be applied to the situations we find ourselves in. And in this particular case, this proverb, we can read this particular proverb looking through the idea of sexual desire. A hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. And perhaps it is within sexual desire that this proverb finds its greatest meaning. Maybe there's more. But this proverb is especially helpful. Abstinence from sexual relations can create a longing in the heart, which is why this proverb is so important. Seeing Proverbs 13, verse 12, through the lens of sex helps us see just how heartsick we become if we are not able to either control our emotions or fulfill them in marriage. Even in abstinence, the heart can grow sick from its longings. And then we need to face Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28, that lust is adultery. And fulfilling our desires through lust is sin as well. Often when we are in pain, we will seek relief through whatever painkiller or source of pleasure is available to us, including pornography and sex of any kind. Consider that Job had experienced great trauma, and you know the story of Job. He lost everything. And during his conversations with his friends, he said this, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. For what is our lot from God above, our heritage from the Almighty on high? Is it not ruin for the wicked, disaster for those who do wrong? Does he not see my ways and count my every step? The Lord sees all that we do. He knows all that we feel. He knows all that we think. Nothing is hidden. He sees the heart sickness in us, our longings and desires, the good ones and the bad. And so we need to be aware of our heart sickness when we struggle with these temptations. So for our application today, I want to approach the rhythm of chastity from a couple different points of view. First is confronting lust. Lust is an insatiable desire. No amount of erotic thought will ever satisfy its craving. It will always want more. Mr. Spurgeon once made a parable, and he said, there was once a tyrant who summoned one of his subjects into his presence and ordered him to make a chain. The poor blacksmith, and that was his occupation, had to go to work and forge the chain. When it was done, he brought it into the presence of the tyrant and was ordered to take it away and make it twice the length. He brought it again to the tyrant, and again he was ordered to double it. Back he came when he had obeyed the order, and the tyrant looked at it, and then commanded the servants to bind the man hand and foot with the chain that he had made and cast him into prison. That is what the devil does with us, Mr. Spurgeon said. He makes us forge our own chains and then binds us hand and foot with it and casts us into outer darkness. The way to deal with lust is to find something else to crave. Now, I'm not talking about chocolate or money or holiday trips to your favorite destination, though we may crave those things. I'm talking about having a picture of who you want to become. Who do you want to be in 5 years or 20 years? Do you have a picture of who you want to become? And if you do, will you aim for it? Do you want to be free from lust? Then you will need to make small changes and have small victories to strengthen your resistance to lust. Thomas Costain wrote in his history book, The Three Edwards, and he described the life of Reynold III, a 14th century duke in what is now Belgium. Reynold was grossly overweight and was commonly called by his Latin nickname Crassus, which means fat. After a violent quarrel, Reynold's younger brother Edward led a successful revolt against him. Edward captured Reynold, but did not kill him. Instead, he built a room around Reynold in the new Kirk Castle and promised him he could regain his title and property as soon as he was able to leave the room. This would not have been difficult for most people, since the room had several windows and a door of near normal size, and none was locked or barred. The problem was Reynold's size. To regain his freedom, he needed to lose weight. But Edward knew his older brother, and each day he sent a variety of delicious foods. Instead of dieting his way out of prison, Reynold grew fatter. And when Duke Edward was accused of cruelty, he had a ready answer. My brother is not a prisoner. He may leave when he so wills. Reynold stayed in that room for 10 years and wasn't released until after Edward died in battle. And then his health was so ruined, Reynold died a year later. He was a prisoner of his own appetite. Small changes help us with resisting the temptation, not just with food, but with sex. And you will find yourself more victorious over the long haul. A determination of white-knuckling of repressed feelings doesn't work. You have to train yourself over time to not indulge the desire, and eventually you will find yourself not thinking about lust nearly as often as you used to. But you still need to remain vigilant. Commit to not looking at erotic billboards or shops in the mall. And a strength of resistance will be built. If the digital experience is also a problem for you, consider getting software on your phone that blocks it out, and have somebody else with the password and accountability built into it so you don't have control. It serves as a wall, a block, so you know that somebody else will know if you dive into things that you ought not to. Second, we need to honor the image of God. God created His people in His image, and they are to be treated with respect. When we choose to look at people as sexual objects, we forget that they are loved and cherished by God. All people deserve to be respected as God's creation. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my message, the discipline of chastity will first train you to control your thoughts and emotions. And second, train you to have friendships with the opposite sex that does not lead to sexual thoughts or feelings. Third, as I mentioned earlier, the discipline of chastity needs to be done with proper timing and permission, especially if you're married. We pull away from gratifying the sexual desires so that we can pray and train ourselves to resist temptation by not being governed by the slightest impulse. In many ways, this discipline, as I've already mentioned, is like fasting. It teaches us self-control. So talk with your spouse, and both of you can intentionally set aside time for prayer to learn how to practice chastity properly for the sake of developing holiness. And fourth, while God does call some to be single for the remainder of their lives, marriage is part of the creation story. The impulses and drives within each of us will drive us crazy unless we get married. Improper chastity will only cause the desires to overwhelm us, and the only biblical and loving place to fulfill those desires is within the marriage between one man and one woman. So take Paul's warnings about burning seriously from 1 Corinthians 7. I'd like to read Matthew chapter 19, verse 10 to 12 right now. This passage comes during the conversation about divorce Jesus is having and the permanency of marriage and how important marriage is. The disciples said to him, "If this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry." And Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." The disciples made the mistake in this passage to see marriage as a torturous obligation and concluded that it is better not to marry. And Jesus takes their comments and he makes a comment of his own, but gives a response in a positive way. And what he does is he he says that for some, it is God's will for them to remain single, and it's up to them to accept it. Jesus mentions 3 types of singleness. For instance, some were born without the proper genitalia. Some were castrated for official functions, for instance, like the Ethiopian eunuch who was castrated to work among royal women, so that they never had to worry about him. And some adopted abstinence for the sake of serving the kingdom, like John the Baptist and Jesus. Singleness is not a holier lifestyle than marriage, nor vice versa. So for those that are single, I want to encourage you. The Lord loves you and honors your commitment to the kingdom. Be diligent in prayer, rely upon the strength of the Lord to resist the devil, and serve God with all of your heart. You are to be honored just as much as any married couple. Now, I'm going to invite the worship team to come up here and lead us in a last song. But I want to remind us to let us uphold the sanctity of marriage and singleness by learning to develop self-control through proper chastity and not allow this sex-crazed culture to overwhelm the church with its pornography, fornication, adultery, and sexual perversion. Let us all surrender our thoughts, emotions, and bodies to the Lord for His kingdom's sake. Let us encourage one another to keep up the good fight. Let us support and help those who struggle with sexual addiction. Let us be a safe place for people to find healing and find people who are willing to walk the path of healing with them. But first, in this last song, let us come to the altar of God in confession and ask for cleansing and forgiveness.